So we're on page Chaf Daled, and we're on the second paragraph, starting with the word V'harei. This book is called Tomer Devorah, the palm tree of Devorah, which is based on something in the verses which talks about a prophet, woman, a prophetess named Devorah. Mm-hmm. She was the leader of the Jewish people, like Yeshua. She was a judge of the entire Jewish people. And this book, of course, was not written by her. It was a person from Tanakh. But this book, Tomer Devorah, was written by somebody named Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, who was a Kabbalist in Sfat around the year 1500, in the 1500s. And here he's going through, in this book, two parts. The first part is talking about the Yud Gimel Midot of Rachamim, and the second part is talking about the 10 Sfirot. Okay? In either case, whether it's the Yud Gimel Midot of Rachamim or the Eser Sfiros, he's talking about these things in more Kabbalistic terms, with an intention of bringing it down practically for us in order to improve our and benefit our daily living. Mm-hmm. So far we've gone through, this is the 9th of the 13 attributes. And the Mida is V'sashlich b'mtzulos yam kol hatoisam, that one of the 9th of the 13th attribute is God throws our transgressions into the depths of the sea so that they should become lost, basically purified and lost, and no longer speak evilly against us, our transgressions, after a person does proper tshuva. And one of the things that he was pointing out here is that there's a quality of tshuva whereby a person almost kind of throws or transfers his iniquity, his transgression through tshuva onto another object. For example, the Seher Mishtaleach, which was the scapegoat of the Yom Kippur service. Mm-hmm. 2 goats, one was sacrificed in the temple, and the other was sent off into the wilderness and thrown off a cliff. The question is, why does this animal suffer? Because the Jewish people transgress. Mm-hmm. And the same thing applies to other instances, like Pharaoh brought the punishment against the Jewish people which they deserved, and therefore Pharaoh was like an agent of God. So why was Pharaoh punished? And the same thing with Haman or any others. Mm-hmm. Why do we find that they're punished and ultimately they're doing the will of God, bringing about the punishment that was deserved by the Jewish people upon themselves? Mm-hmm. So the author's basic idea is that part of tshuva involves using an instrument to bring about the tshuva, to bring about the atonement on the Jewish people, and then that object, by definition, becomes negated because the atonement takes place. And until that object is negated, the atonement can't be complete. And therefore, even though Pharaoh catalyzed the tshuva of the Jewish people, and it was through their suffering that their transgressions were atoned, still as an agent of that atonement, Pharaoh had to be nullified in order for that to become complete. And another point that he spoke about was how this is related to the idea of shutting the trap of the accusing forces against us by throwing them scraps, like you'd throw a bone at a dog in order to keep the dog away from the table. So too, the suffering that sometimes takes place to Jewish people is kind of like in a way of appeasing but shutting the trap of the accuser. While in the meantime, through tshuva, a person gets to do atonement. It becomes purified. Mm-hmm. So that brings us more or less up to this page, Chaf Daled. And the verse here, the second paragraph. V'harei bozei mamash sod hatzelem shel Nebuchadnezzar. This has to do with the secret mystery behind the image that is referred to in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the ruler of the ancient Babylonian Empire. And this image is described in the book of Daniel, chapter 2. It's quite an involved story here. In the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he dreamt a dream. His spirit was agitated and his sleep was interrupted. The king sent to call the necromancers, the astrologers, the sorcerers, the stargazers, to tell the king his dream and its meaning. I'm paraphrasing. So the advisors say, King, tell us the dream, we'll tell the interpretation, but if you don't tell us the dream, how can we interpret it? He says, if you're true in your powers, then you'll be able to tell me my dream and its interpretation. And if you don't, you'll die. So they beseeched the king and they said, please, king, nothing's ever been heard like this. That the interpreter has to tell the dream and its interpretation. The person who has the dream tells the dream and the interpreter interprets it. It wouldn't help. If you don't tell me the dream and its interpretation, you die. So they besought the help of Daniel, who was one of the leaders of the Jewish people who had been exiled to Babylon. And Daniel divined the dream, and he went to the king. So Arioch brought Daniel before the king in haste and said to him, I have found a man from the people of the exile of Judah who will make known the interpretation to the king. The king responded and said to Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, are you capable of making known to me the dream that I saw and its interpretation? Daniel answered before the king and said, the secret the king requests, no wise men, astrologers, necromancers, or demonists are able to tell the king. Nobody could tell you what you dream. But there's a God in heaven who reveals secrets and has informed King Nebuchadnezzar what will be at the end of days. Your dream and the visions in your head on your bed are these. And now Daniel starts to tell the king the story of his dream and its interpretation. King, your thoughts came while you were on your bed about what would happen in the future, and the revealer of secrets informed you what will be. As for me, it is not because I possess more wisdom than any other being that this secret was revealed to me, but rather to make the interpretation known to the king, so that you may know what has occupied your thoughts. He humbly said from the outset, this is not coming from me, my wisdom. And here's the dream. Oh, king, you were watching, and behold, a huge statue. This statue, which was immense and whose brightness was extraordinary, stood opposite you, and its appearance was fearsome. This statue, its head was of fine gold, its breast and arms of silver. Yeah, its breast and its arms were made of silver. Its belly and thighs were made of copper. Its legs of iron. So it had 4 parts: a head of gold, a torso and arms of silver, the belly and the legs of bronze, and the legs were of iron. The thighs, meaning the belly and the thighs, were of copper, and the legs were made out of iron. And its feet were partly of iron and partly of earthenware, clay. Any ideas about what this means? As you watched, a stone was hewn without hands and struck the statue on its feet of iron and earthenware, the combination of iron and clay, and crumbled them. Then they crumbled together, the iron, which was the thighs, and the earthenware, the feet, the copper, the silver and the gold, it all came crumbling down. They became like chaff from summer threshing floors and blew away with the wind. And the wind carried them away, and no trace was found of them. And the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the entire earth. This is the dream, and we will tell its interpretation before the king. So here's the interpretation. You, O king, to whom the King of Kings, who is the God of heaven, has given a strong kingdom, power, and honor. And whatever people, beasts of the field, and birds of the sky dwell, he has given them into your hand and made you rule over them all. You are the head of gold. Strong. That's referring to the Babylonian Empire. And after you will arise another kingdom inferior to you, corresponding to the chest and the arms of silver, lower down, more inferior. And then a third kingdom of copper, which will rule the entire earth. The fourth kingdom will be as strong as iron. Just as iron crumbles and flattens everything, and as iron shatters all these, it will crumble and shatter this iron empire, this empire of iron. The feet and the toes that you saw, partly of potter's earthenware and partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom, and will have some of the firmness of iron, just as you saw iron mixed with clay. As for the toes, partly of iron and partly of earthenware, part of the kingdom will be powerful, and part of it will be broken. That you saw iron mixed with clay like the earthenware. They will mix with the offspring of men, but they will not cling to one another. These two aspects of the final empire. Just as iron does not mix with earthenware. Pretty intense. Then in the days of these kingdoms, the God of heaven will establish a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will its sovereignty be left to another people. It will crumble and consume all these kingdoms, and it will stand forever. Just as you saw that the stone was hewn from the mountain, but not by human hands, and it crumbled the iron, the copper, the earthenware, the silver, and the gold, so has the great God made known to the king what will happen in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is reliable. What is this a reference to? The 4 world empires that would form the backbone of human experience, of human culture, of human history. The greatest influence across the world, originating in Babylon, very early times, the head of gold. Afterwards, succeeded by a second empire, that of Persia, corresponding to the torso and the arms of silver. After that, the empire of Greece, the Greek Empire, and all of the beauty and scintillating, tantalizing culture of the Greeks corresponds to the thighs of copper. And then the legs of iron corresponds to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, the strongest and most vicious, horrific empire that marched across the world, conquering everybody with their might. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. The Roman Empire was the final world empire, but aspects of that Roman Empire which European culture inherited reaches down into history, into our very times. That corresponds to the legs, the feet, which were intermingled with clay, and the clay, sand, is understood to be referring to the descendants of Ishmael, the Arabs. That in the final times there will be a union between the European nations, the descendants of the Roman Empire, with all of their power of iron, together with the power of the Arab nations, who, as sand, is something which is of no value whatsoever. Unlike the gold and the silver and the copper and the iron, the Arab nations who inhabit the sandy desert regions of the world have no value other than the fact of what's hidden underneath the sand. That's the oil, right? And it's a reference to the future union between the nations of iron, who need fuel to fuel their weapons and their instruments and their vehicles of iron. And there will be therefore a union between the West and the East, the descendants of Esav in Europe and the descendants of Ishmael and the Arabs in the East. And this union will usher in this last period. But they're not going to mix well. The iron and the sand don't mix. They can't make one. There'll be a union. There'll be some type of a cooperation. There'll be some type of a give and take. But the alliance is very fragile. It can't mix. And therefore, it can be easily broken apart. And that's what's going to happen, he says here, that God will ultimately intervene. And the king sees a stone hewn out with no hands. That's a reference to the Melech HaMashiach. Mashiach will come and with his powers break that unnatural alliance between the iron and the sand, and the whole thing will come tumbling down, so that all of the influence of all of those empires which sent humanity marching through the centuries will ultimately be crumbled, destroyed, pass away, and fly away like chaff in the wind. At that point, The new world order, that which is initiated by Mashiach, will be a new mountain, like the mountain of Sinai, upon which the Torah will be given to, the teaching of the Torah will be given to all of humanity. So when Daniel interpreted this dream for the king, not only did he interpret the dream, but God revealed the dream to Daniel in exact detail, as the king himself saw it, wouldn't reveal to anybody. Daniel told him what the dream was. He also told him what the interpretation was. When the king heard this, he fell on his face and prostrated himself to Daniel, and with offering and incense, he wished to exalt him. He wanted to deify him. The king wanted to deify Daniel. He wouldn't let him do it, Daniel. The king exclaimed to Daniel and said, "In truth, I know that your God is the God over gods, Lord of kings, and the revealer of secrets, since you were able to reveal this secret." Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts. He empowered him as ruler over the entire land of Babylon and chief official over all the sages of Babylonia. Daniel requested of the king, and he appointed Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego over the affairs of the land of Babylonia, and Daniel was at the king's gate. So, in the merit of his having revealed the dream and its interpretation, he was elevated above all other advisors and became a ruler over Babylonia, next to Nebuchadnezzar, one of the most powerful people who ever existed. So now, it's about some of the verses in this event that our author wants to continue his discussion of the ninth of the 13 attributes. So now, after having seen that, we can see the text. Chaf Dalet.
Some say that Daniel was by Haman, by the palace. Not that far away.
Well, yeah. After the Persians overcame the Babylonians, then maybe he passed on from being the advisor of one to the other. These ideas can be used to understand the mystery of this form that of Nebuchadnezzar that he saw in the dream. Nimsu Israel b'yad melech Bavel. The Jewish people were given over into the hands of the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, having destroyed the first temple and taking the Jews captivity by the waters of Babylon. And it says there in the Psukim, Reshe Didahav, the head was made out of gold. That we saw, right? Nichno hahu resha, that head was subdued. V'nimseru b'yad paras, and it was given over in the hands of the Persians. Shehen chadohe udroe dichsaf, and they are what's referred to in the continuation of the vision, which says that the chest and the arms were made out of silver, so that the head of gold of Babylon fell under the sway and the control of the arms of Persia. V'chen nitchu elu b'pnei elu, and so too the Persians were overcome and pushed out ad sheyardu Yisrael l'raglohe minhon, until the Jewish people passed down to the legs difarzel, which were made out of barzel, or iron. So what he's saying is that the Jews were taken captivity into Babylon. The Babylonians were then conquered by the Persians, and the Jews stayed in Persia. The Persians were then conquered by the Greeks, and the Jews remained under the influence of the Greeks. Right? The Greeks were then overcome by the Romans, and the Jews stayed under the control of the Romans. Minahon dichasaf, all the way down to the final stage where the legs and the feet were intermingled with iron and clay. V'maye tachlis hatov, what's going to be the good, the final good that comes out of this? Basof HaKadosh Baruch Hu ma'amidam v'oise behen din. In the end, all of these nations who subdued and enslaved, not only physically, but mentally and spiritually, the Jewish people, God is going to set them up and bring justice against them. K'deksiv, as it says, Chatzi achale bam, chitzai achale bam. I will empty my arrows upon them. Like an archer takes from his quiver arrows. Yeah. I'm going to empty out my quiver. All of my arrows are going to be sent against them. Chitzai kalim v'Yisrael enim kalim. The Gemara comments that my arrows will be depleted, but Israel will not be depleted. They'll not be destroyed. So what he's referring to is that throughout history, when the Jews were transgressing, he used their servitude to these nations as a way of punishing them. And God's directing their punishment against the Jewish people was like sending arrows against them. But the arrows end, and the Jewish people will not be terminated. They'll continue to exist, to live. That's the Gemara in Sota. And it says, B'dayin daku kechado, and the feet had together parzula, chaspa, nechoisha, kaspa, v'dahava. B'dayin daku kechado, and then everything will be crumbled together, this parzula, the iron, the chaspa, the clay, nechoisha, the copper, kaspa, the silver, v'da'ava, the gold. It'll all come crumbling down. Hine, b'atchala ksiv, initially it's written, umechas l'tzalma araglohi, that this stone which is being hewn out will smash the feet of this statue, of this figure. Ein mikol etzelem ele raglov. Shekvar nisbatel koicham ve'avu roish ve'droe ve'moe. Vim kol ze basof daku kahada. He says, the truth is that it only says that he's going to hit the feet. The feet are the only thing that's left. Why? Because each empire was already nullified through being conquered by the subsequent one. And still, nevertheless, it says in the end that all of these are going to be ground up all together. How is that? The gold was already taken by the silver, and the silver was taken by the copper, and the copper by the iron. And we see that the verses say that the stone that was hewn out breaks the feet, the weak connection between the iron and the clay. So how does it say that in the end everything was all crumbled together? Each stage was already crumbled because from the stage after it. The answers, Osi de Kodesh Baruch Hu la'amid Samael v'hareshoim oisei ma'asav v'pulasav. In the future, what's going to happen is that God is going to temporarily reestablish the forces of evil. This is that Malach, the Samach Mem, and all of his negative, harmful acts. V'yaseh behem adin, and he will do judgment upon them. V'hainu, and this is what's meant now back into our phrase here, the 9th of the 13 attributes. V'sashlich b'mtzelos yam kol hatoisam. God will throw into the depths all of their transgressions. Yirtzei, what this means to say is, mashlich koyach hadin. God will throw out the attribute of judgment. L'pa'el al yedei elu shehem mitzulas yam, to act upon even those that are in the depths of the sea. So he's talking here about a complete annihilation, and a complete annulment of any force that was ever used to bring punishment against the Jewish people, in order to bring about their complete atonement. So that even if Babylon was replaced by Persia, and Persia was replaced by Greece, and Greece by Rome, ultimately all of them are going to be, to a certain extent, reestablished, so that all of them can be dismantled by God himself, in order to nullify entirely any negative influence they had, and also to bring about the complete, full, and final atonement of the Jewish people. V'rashoim kiyam nigrash, like it says in the verse, and the wicked will be tossing and turning like a turmoiled sea. Ki hashket lo yuchal, and they cannot find tranquility. V'garashu meimav refesh fetit, until finally the waves will emit dirt and refuse and the like. What is this referring to? Elohem oisim din v'Yisrael. This is referring to those who were used to bring judgment against Israel. Sheyoshiv achakach kol geulam b'rosham. That eventually God will bring all of their misdeeds back onto their own heads, to annihilate them, to destroy them. V'tam, and the reason for this is Yisrael kiblu din, after the Jewish people received their judgment. HaKadosh Baruch Hu misnachem afilu al masha kodam. God repents over what he had done beforehand, the actual punishment itself. V'tovei bonam, and as a result of this, God claims their God champions the suffering of the Jewish people, even though the punishment was something that they deserved. But when they do tshuva, then God regrets even having punished them. And as a result of that, those who caused their suffering will also receive their retribution. Volodai, and not only this, Ela ani kotzafti me'at. I was angry a little bit. The pasuk says, V'hema azru l'ra. But they helped to make it much more wicked. I think this is a reference to what we were saying before about another reason given as to why those who persecuted the Jewish people, even though it was through the auspices of God in order to bring about their tshuva, why they were punished, because I was angry a little bit, God says, but they increased the evil to a much greater extent. They brought retribution against the Jewish people to a degree which was much greater than I ever had in mind. And it's for that part of what they did wrong that they'll be punished. Okay? So this is what he seems to be saying. That eventually God will bring about will bring back and bring judgment upon all of those enemies of Israel, who even if they were destroyed, even if they're destroyed, and they were like sunk into the depths of history, God ultimately will bring them back out of the depths of history in order to bring about a final judgment against them for what they did wrong. That's how great his chesed is. And all of this, why? Because God ultimately, in a way, has remorse over the punishment that was brought against the Jewish people once they did tshuva and received atonement. And now, he's going to display that judgment against the perpetrators of the evil. Okay? So to conclude this section, he's going to say how we can translate this particular attribute, the 9th or the 13th attributes of God, how we can translate that to us in terms of improving our practical living. Also, in this attribute, a person has to try and behave with his fellow human being. Even if this person is a rasha, he's wicked, nasty, but now he's suffering, great suffering, presumably because of the evil that he's done. Al yisnehu, don't hate him at this point. Why? Because now that he's become ensnared with the retribution of his transgressions, and he's suffering, and he's in a bad shape, now he's like you. Beforehand, he was wicked, and he lorded his power over you, and he harmed you, and he persecuted you, and he embarrassed you. But now that he's down, right, rather than rejoice over his downfall, you should say, I'm willing to forgive. He's like my friend. V'yikarev hamordim v'hane'enoshim v'yirachem eleihem. And therefore a person should try and bring close those who have rebelled against God, but now they are being punished. You should have mercy over them. Yeah, how so? Just like we, the Jewish people, rebelled against God, punishment was brought upon us. We did tshuva and were atoned. God brings us back and is actually upset about the suffering that was used. So too, when we see somebody who's rebelled against us, even when they're broken, right? Now that they're broken, he's not talking about until they're broken. He's talking about after they're broken, you should have mercy on them. And not say, oh, he's getting what he deserves. Finally, he's getting what he deserves. I'm not going to intervene on his behalf. No, he's down. He's down for the count. He's broken. He's being humbled for his transgressions. So that's not a time to be someone who's going to pass judgment on him. But rather, you should empathize with him now and say, it's true. Right? You did what you did, but now you're suffering, being humbled. And I empathize with that. I'll give you a helping hand, not to turn yourself against the person. In this way, you're being mekarev these people who are suffering their punishments and have mercy on them. Even more so, you should actually make an effort to save them and spare them from their suffering. And you shouldn't say, he deserves it. He brought it upon himself. His transgression is bringing about this suffering. Let him wallow in it. No, don't say that. Rather, you should have mercy on him through the example of this midah. That after a person is broken and he does tshuva, then you should have mercy on him and accept him back. Kid Parashti, as is explained in this section on the 9th midah. Okay, let's stop here. Continue on the 10th tomorrow.